In the Muslim tradition, Arabic is definitely part of the worldview of the Muslims. And there's a theory in linguistics, Sapir-Whorf theory of language, which is also the language relativity theory, which is the idea that a language is not simply a means of communication, but embedded in the language is a worldview. In other words, that individuals articulate their worldview through their language. And this is important. Now, just to give you a good example of that, the word in English for reality, right, is related to a Latin word. Does anybody have Latin? Know that word? Res. Does anybody know what res means in Latin? Thing. Really good. I'm glad. Got some old Latin people around here. Res equals thing. Now, that's a very interesting concept right there. In other words, embedded in the language itself is they're telling you what we think about reality. Reality is thing. There is an inherent materialism in that word. You see, there's an inherent materialism in that word. Now, to take an example of the word in Arabic for reality is haqiqa. The root word is haq, which is a name of God. Al-haqqu means the real, and it is one of the 99 names of God. So embedded in the Arabic language, the perception of reality is already related to something that is beyond this. It is related to the divine. There is an idea, in a sense, that reality itself is not what we are experiencing in the realm of things, but actually transcends the realm of things. Because in the Islamic tradition, God is not a thing. God is not a thing. The word in Arabic for thing is shay. And shay is it comes from a word which means that which is willed into existence. So thing is something that emerges into existence from non-existence. So reality transcends thing in the Islamic worldview. Reality transcends thing. So within the Arabic language, we're going to see certain semantic fields that are created by these triliteral roots, that are based on these three roots, that are articulating something very important about reality. Now, if we look at the word iman, which is faith, it's translated generally as faith, iman. Its root is three letters. Alif, Mim, Nun. Amina means to be safe or secure. To be safe or secure. Iman is a verbal noun that comes from, there's 15 forms of every verb. So you literally, each verb is going to create a whole semantic field by which you'll get nuances of the meanings of the word. Iman is from a fourth form out of the 15 forms that literally means to make oneself safe and secure. So the idea here is that faith is an anchoring element in the human experience. And lack of faith is something that creates a type of trouble, of turbulence within the psyche itself. Now we can see this if you're going into surgery. You'll hear somebody say, well, I have faith in my doctor. Because you don't want to go into surgery not having faith in your doctor. You're going to be a wreck, right? You're going to be a wreck. There's going to be a lot of trauma related to that experience. So the idea of faith as a securing factor in the human condition. Now there's a wonderful, in the Greek tradition, Prometheus gives man fire, which is knowledge. And then Prometheus is cursed by the gods because the gods don't want to have man to have knowledge because man's going to compete with the gods. Prometheus, once he's on the rock in Aeschylus' play, and he's Prometheus bound, and he's they're asking him what he was given, what he gave to man. He said, I gave him fire and I taught him the crafts, right? And then he said, what else? And he said, I gave him faith. In other words, without faith, the human being is in a hopeless state, right? So there's an idea that we need faith. If we have all the knowledge in the world, if we know how to do all these things, but we don't have faith in the future, in tomorrow, we go into a state of despair. And human beings cannot function in a state of despair. A study that they did with rats, where they would put a rat, this is horrible things that scientists do, but sometimes they come up with interesting results. They put a bunch of some rats in water, and then they would let the rats swim until they would drown, right? Well, what they would started to do, they'd time it and they'd say the rats would survive a few minutes. Right before the time that they would normally drown, they would pull them out and save them. And they would do this over and over again. Then they would leave those same rats who had been pulled out and saved and they would go sometimes twice or more than they would normally do had they not been pulled out of the cauldron. So the idea is that even the rat has a concept of hope. That even the rat, as insignificant as its brain is, has a concept of hope. That I might be saved, so I'm going to hang on a little longer. Now there's a story, one man asked a man once if he believed in God. He said no. And he said, well, let me ask you something. He said, if you fall off a ship in the middle of the ocean, do you just give up? And he said, no, I continue to swim. And he said, why? And he said, out of the hopes of being saved. And he said, that's God. You see that there is within us this odd mechanism in our own psyches that says, I'm not going to give up. And this is rooted in this idea of wanting to make oneself secure, of wanting to be in a state of security. So the believer, according to the Islamic tradition, is called a mu'min, somebody who is making themselves safe. How? How do you make yourself safe? In a world of absolute change, we see change everywhere. We have no sense of security in this world. And a person who's in a secure state is in a delusional state. Really, if you think about this, if you feel secure at all times, then you're in a delusional state, especially in California, right? Because I live in California, we hear those shakes every once in a while, just to remind you, it's not that secure, right? We are literally, as human beings, constantly exposing ourselves to death in every instant. Each breath is an exposure to death. And because of that, there's a deep instability. Now, there's a type of veiling that takes place as a mercy, because if we were constantly aware of this state, right, we would be literally wrecks, psychological wrecks. And there are people that go into these states. One of the things Lewis Thomas mentions in one of his essays is the whole fact that nature, right, which is often a scientific word for God, that nature does this wonderful thing of veiling death from us. Even though there's death all around us, you don't see dead animals everywhere. That they're hidden. That you can literally go down this road and go for a long walk and you won't see a dead creature. And yet there's death all over the place. There's death happening, decay. It's happening all over the place. But there's a type of veiling, right? And this enables a human being psychologically to maintain hope for the future. So Iman, or belief, is related in making oneself secure. The first object of belief that will secure an individual, according to the Islamic tradition, is Iman Billah, which means belief in Allah. Now, we know that, all of us know now, that the first statement of the Muslims is La ilaha illallah. And this is usually translated as there is no God but Allah, which I think in many ways is problematic because it leads a person who is not an Arab or not a Muslim to think that Allah is some kind of, there's no God but Allah. In other words, there's no God for the Christians, there's no God for the Jews, there's no God but this God that the Arabs are calling Allah. which is problematic. Because Jewish Arabs call God Allah, and Christian Arabs call God Allah. You see. A Christian Arab calls God Allah, and they call Jesus Ibnullah, the son of Allah. That's what a Christian Arab calls. A Palestinian Christian says, the son of Allah. So this is a linguistic determination from the Arab people for what we know in English as God, which is originally probably an Indo-European word, gut, which you get, it goes into Persian as khuda, right? The Persian word, don't tell any white supremacists, but the Persian word khuda is related to the English word for God, because then it goes into German as gut or Gott, and the original word here is related to the one who is called on when there's no one else to call on. That is God. God is the one we call on when there's no one else to call on. Now, the word Allah in the Arabic language does not designate a meaning. We do not know what it means. Some of the Muslims think that it is originally from ilah, right? The word ilah. And obviously you can see the linguistic similarity there. The Orientalists would definitely say yes, it's got to be. It's just a lamb, it becomes Allah because it's al-ilah, and they take the two lambs together and make it Allah instead of saying al-ilah. The word ilah, it has a plural, it has a masculine and a feminine, right? It has a masculine and a feminine. It also has negative connotations in the Quran as well, whereas Allah does not have negative connotations. Ilah can have negative connotations in the Quran. Allah does not. Allah always has a positive connotation in the Quran. The root word of ilah is aliha, which means to bewilder, to create bewilderment. And this would be consistent, for instance, with San Anselm's idea of God being that which nothing greater can be conceived. That it's the thing that the intellect literally short circuits when it tries to conceptualize. It creates a type of bewilderment in the psyche for us to try to imagine infinity. Infinity, we can't imagine it. We can imagine it as an abstract concept, but we can't really conceptualize the idea of infinity. It's something we can only abstract it, but we cannot grasp the true idea of infinity. And so Allah, when we say La ilaha illallah, there are two things happening here. The first is called nefi, which is a negation. And the second is called ithbat, which is an affirmation. The idea for the Muslims is you must negate before you can affirm. What are you negating? You are negating everything other than Allah. And this is the idea where reality is related to this word al-haq, the real. In other words, the Muslims say, and the nice thing about Arabic, and one of the many nice things, is it does not have the verb to be. So in this, although we read it in English, there is no God but God. In Arabic, that is, which we call an auxiliary verb, I think. Yeah, the is not there. It's not there. Now, this has important philosophical implications because when you relate to the idea of being, again, we can move out of being when we talk about God. See, the Muslims don't view God as a being in the sense of a supreme being in a hierarchy, like the St. Thomas Aquinas idea of a hierarchy of being, God being at the top of the hierarchy. That's really alien to the Islamic tradition. The idea of God here is that God is absolute, that God is ultimate reality, that God, when God's reality is articulated, every other reality vanishes into falsehood or non-existence. This is utter transcendence, in the sense that when we talk about God at one level in the Islamic tradition, we are talking about the radical other. We are talking about that which has no association with anything created. That when we even compare the created to this reality, creation in a sense disappears. Creation has a type of unreality. For the Muslims, what this means is we can supplant any of these words here with the divine names or the attributes. We can say there is no haqq except the haqq. In other words, there is nothing real except the real. We can say there is no generous except the generous. Al-Karim is the name of God. We can say there is no merciful except the merciful. So we can literally take any of the 99 names and put them in this formula and it works. Why? Because when we speak about God, we are negating everything other than God. And this relates to God's absolute greatness, the magnificence of God.
Philosophically, it seems like you're saying God is other, but what about God's immanence?
I'm going to get to that. I will. I'll get to that because it's a very important point. So when we negate, what we are saying is La ilaha, La ilaha, La ilaha, La ilaha, La ilaha. The sun, La ilaha. The moon, La ilaha. The stars, La ilaha. All of this, La ilaha. There is nothing that I can see, that I can conceive, that I can point to, except that I have to say La ilaha.
What is the difference, that concept that's held, and the concept such as that a Christian would believe in? Or
I think that they can be very similar. I think many Christians will believe this. In fact, the Muslims believe that this is almost really, it's a universal understanding. Right? The Muslims would believe that La ilaha is a universal understanding. But it's quite radical in its implications, and I'm going to get to that related to Tawheed and how this translates into the world, how we behave and act in the world. When we say illallah, this is the affirmation. So negation precedes affirmation in the Islamic tradition. Negation precedes affirmation. We have to negate other before we can affirm what is real or what is true. All right? Now, if we think, many Muslims will say, if somebody says to them, I don't believe in God, then a Muslim would want some clarification. What do you mean by God? Because we might not believe in the same thing. Right? In other words, that there are many people in this time, certainly, that have rejected more traditional concepts of God. And if you move into, in a sense, the Durkheimian view of God, which is really that human beings project, that we project, or the Freudian view, that again human beings felt insecure, they wanted to create a big daddy up in the sky that's going to take care of all of us, makes us feel secure. This is the idea within a modern Western view that in a sense God is a psychological mechanism that enables a human being to create some psychic stability. And there are people that reject that. There are people that reject that idea. From the Muslim point of view, the Muslims would say that belief in God is part of the Fitra nature. It is inherent to the individual. The Quran uses a word which is called Fitra, which means the original nature. The aboriginal nature of the human being is called Fitra. And that is that human beings are, by their nature, believers. They are believers. The problem is, the belief is not full. It is not a correct belief because of a misunderstanding about ilah. So you have animists. Animists believe in something outside of themselves, right? Or you have somebody that associates with God, that believes that there's duality. For instance, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, or multiplicity of gods in Hinduism. And even if you get into the Brahman, the Brahmins what they don't tell the other people is that they really don't believe in the idols, right? At the highest level of Hinduism, these are kind of simple ways of allowing people that have not evolved enough. They haven't moved into the Brahman class, which takes several lifetimes, right? But the Brahmins can understand God as the Atma, or that which does not have form. So they do have a concept of a formless God, right? Nirguna. They do have that concept. But the Muslims would say all of these ways of viewing or understanding God, if they are not preceded by negation, will fall into an incorrect understanding. And the idea is that the intellect cannot know God except through God. There is a Fitra nature, which is to recognize that God exists, to recognize that there's something outside of myself. But the intellect is not sufficient enough to understand God as God wants to be understood. And this is where we get revelation. So the next object of faith, right? Amantu billahi wa bi kutubihi. There's books. There are dispensations. So the books are dispensations from God in which God explains to His creation what He wants them to understand about Him.